Hello. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Olga Ryrakovsky, and I am the Programs, Partners, and Engagement Manager here at the Vilna Shul, Boston Center for Jewish Culture. The Vilna, located in historic Boston Beacon Hill, is the last remaining immigrant-era synagogue building in Boston and now serves as a center for Jewish engagement. We offer opportunities to connect and explore one's culture, experience the arts, and engage in big ideas and pressing issues for Boston's Jewish community. We are so excited to be hosting this Women's History event with all of you. And we are thrilled to have Nadine Hoffman and Nadine Epstein to discuss Nadine Epstein's book. I will be introducing Nadine Hoffman, who is a vice president at the Vilna and has served on the board for the past 4 years. She has experience in the financial and legal sectors and lives with her husband and 2 children in Somerville, MA. Nadie will be introducing Nadine and moderating the discussion, and I will be joining back at the end for the Q&A. Before we get started, I wanted to clarify a few housekeeping rules. First, this conversation will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel tomorrow. And second, if you have a question, please feel free to enter in the Q&A as I will be fielding those to Nadine at the end. Lastly, we will all be muted for tonight's discussion because there is a lot of us. And I'm so excited to introduce Nadie and let the discussion begin.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We are thrilled to have Nadine Epstein tonight. Nadine is an award-winning journalist. She's the editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment magazine, which is a major Jewish magazine in the US, for those of you who don't know. And she's also the author of several books and the founder of many initiatives within Moment. And what we will talk about this evening is actually this book, RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, which Nadine wrote in collaboration with Justice Ginsburg. Welcome, Nadine.
Hi.
Hi. Can you tell us a little bit about how did you get to know Justice Ginsburg?
Well, so I'm the editor of Moment, editor-in-chief of Moment, and the CEO of Moment. And I discovered along the way that Justice Ginsburg was a devoted reader of Moment, which was a delight. And I interviewed her a few times, and I helped her with some projects that she was working on. And she came to some of our dinners, and we just became friends. And because we're here in Washington, DC, and she's in Washington. She was in Washington also. And also in 2019, we gave her our Human Rights Award. And we gave this award in New York at the Yale Club. And we were so excited, and it was an incredibly beautiful evening. And she was so happy. And we gave her this beautiful collar that we had commissioned for her called the Zedek collar. And she loved it so much that she wanted to wear it the first day of her term in 2019. Of course, we had no idea, that was her last term. And she asked me to bring the collar and other things to her in Washington and bring them to her chambers. And that's how the conversation about this book began. That's when it began, in chambers.
Wow. So how did that conversation start, and how did you start choosing the women to include in the book? And I would say more specifically, how did you choose whom not to include? Because I could imagine that was a very difficult choice.
Well, for starters, we were just sitting in her office and her chambers, and her chambers were incredibly beautiful, by the way. I mean, they were filled with art and memorabilia and photographs. And she had a real artistic eye, as you can tell by how she dressed. She dressed beautifully with kind of just this very arty flair. And her chambers were like that. So they were just so beautiful. And I remember I was just sitting there, and she had like a white couch, and she was sitting in a little white chair next to me. And we were talking about some of the women like who really helped, as she said it, sustain her during difficult times in her life. And they were Jewish women like Henrietta Sold and Emma Lazarus and Anne Frank. And we were talking, she was talking about this, and then I started telling her, because I was a really nerdy kid, that I used to read, like when I was a kid, I read every biography in my school library. Maybe there was 350 of them, and 10 of them were about women, Molly
Wow.
Pitcher and Clara Barton and Amelia Earhart and Louisa May Alcott, but there really weren't very many. And there weren't really many biographies about women in my synagogue library either, and at all. And they were biblical women, but they weren't like women who had gone out, modern women who wanted to have home, have families, but also be out in the world and create change. So I just told her that I'd always wanted this, and she agreed. And so I said something, I said, probably I say every week, because I'm a writer and editor, to somebody, I say, well, this is a great idea, we should write a book about it. And Justice Ginsburg just said yes, because she was very blunt, and she didn't add a lot of, she wasn't super super warm, and she didn't add a lot of words to extra words to things, but she really just said yes. And there we were on a journey to write a book, and we really didn't know what that book was. But we started throwing out names of women, like she started saying, well, first of all, we have to have all the women with Haggadah. And I was like, biblical women in the book? And she was like, yes, we have to have Miriam, we have to have Yocheved, we have to have Shifra, the midwives, and we have to have Pharaoh's daughter. And I was like, Pharaoh's daughter? I didn't even know she was Jewish. She goes, it doesn't matter whether she was Jewish or not. These are the women who made Judaism survive. These are the women who rescued Judaism. These are the women who rescued Moses. They're the ones that led to the survival of the Israelites. So turns out, by the way, I didn't know at the time, because I hadn't really thought about it, that according to Midrash, actually, Pharaoh's daughter became Jewish. She married into the Levite tribe, and she also left Egypt with the Israelites. So, but anyway, so those were the first women. And then she listed many other women, including Henrietta Szold and Emma Lazarus and Anne Frank. And then I mentioned some women. So now she was really busy. Like, we were both, by the way, way too busy to do this book. I already have 5 full-time jobs. I was working on 2 other books. She was, a Supreme Court Justice of the United States who took her work very, very seriously. She had other things to do. I had other things to do. So I went home and I started researching women, and I came up with a list about 150 women for us to talk about. And so we discussed these women, and we ended up choosing about 30, 35, 36 women, because that's all we thought that we could really do in the amount of even. And as it turns out, we actually only really did 33, although we did a couple other women who just didn't get in the book. But it was a never-ending conversation, because even after I was already working on the biographies of the women, she was still sending me names by email. This is like, a month and a half before she died. She's
Wow.
sending me emails and going, well, what about this woman? And you forgot this woman, and we should do this woman. And it was a little overwhelming. And sometimes I couldn't actually get back to her. Like, I couldn't even process all the women that she wanted to do. How we chose the women out of 150 women really ended up being the women that she really cared about. Like, she really had some women who just meant so much to her, and that she'd been thinking about for so long. Most of those women are in the book. And then I added women who I thought provided a little bit more diversity, because Justice Ginsburg, given her druthers, would have had all lawyers, all writers, and all musicians. And I added mathematicians and politicians and some other women. And she ended up learning about the women I thought were important. And then I learned about the women and I hadn't even heard of some of her women, and she hadn't heard of some of the women I thought were important. But we learned about each other's women in the process, which was a wonderful thing.
What are some of the women that you learned about from her, and vice versa? Maybe give us 2 or 3 that she really cared about and that you really cared about.
So, okay, there was all the biblical women that she really loved, the biblical women. Fanny Mendelssohn, who's Felix Mendelssohn's sister. She was a musician perhaps a more talented musician than her brother Felix, who we know much better. But Fanny was not allowed to perform in public or to publish music under her own name. And basically, Justice Ginsburg felt this was an incredible injustice, and she was very, really wanted Fanny to be in the book. She also, of course, adored Henrietta Szold, who I thought, was the founder of Hadassah, but in reading about her and learning about her, she's really an incredible woman. This woman actually went to rabbinical school and had to promise ahead of time that she wouldn't become a rabbi. So she was allowed to go to rabbinical school. She wouldn't request ordination, but she did amazing things throughout her life. Gertrude Berg was another one who Justice Ginsburg really just, I think, adored, because she had grown up listening to Gertrude Berg playing Molly Goldberg on the radio. And turns out Gertrude Berg was really an incredible woman who built a media empire, who kind of was the predecessor to Lucille Ball and to Oprah Winfrey, one of the first women to do that. There were other women that she really liked that she had met in the book, like Rita Levi-Montalcini. And also Roberta Peters. Roberta Peters was a soprano, a Jewish woman who became a star at the Met at a very young age, and who just meant so much to Justice Ginsburg. I'd never heard of her either. So these were just some of the women. For me, I added Salome Alexandra. So I'm really into like women who have wielded power and how women wield power. I'm really interested in this. And I think Justice Ginsburg was also. But Salome Alexandra was really one of the last full monarch who had a full reign of the Israelites, of the Judeans. And she was an amazing person. During her era, it was a golden age for Judea. And also, she basically paved the path for rabbinical Judaism. This is a really important woman who's a queen of Judea, a Jewish queen who nobody pays any attention to. She's not a biblical figure. She's a historical figure. And very few women were written about it by historians, but she was actually written about by Flavius Joseph, who called her a really wise leader. This is pretty impressive, and nobody talks about her. And I added Gracia Mendes Nasi because she's just such an amazing woman. I mean, this is a woman who had more power and was the wealthiest woman of her time. She was a shipping magnate. In the 15th century, women aren't doing this kind of thing. She uses her power and her wealth to bring Jews out of Portugal and Spain to save them from the Inquisition. What an amazing woman. She rebuilds like Jewish communities in Antwerp and then in Italy and then Constantinople. And hundreds of years before we get to Herzl, she creates a Jewish homeland in Palestine. That's just so amazing. And the fact that we don't talk about her more, and I know we talk about her more than we once did, but she deserves so much more attention. I adore Ernestine Rose. Ernestine Rose, first of all, she's one of the founding mothers of the American suffragist movement. No one even talks about her, like along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the other leaders, but this is a woman who was born in Poland. Her father was a really strict rabbi who her mom dies when she's 16 and leaves her a fortune. Her father promises that fortune to a man he's decided that she's going to marry. She says no. He says yes. She goes to the next town by herself, goes to civil court, acts as her own lawyer, wins the case, gets her freedom, gets her money, gives most of the money back to her father, takes enough to go off and become an entrepreneur traveling around Europe, invents her own business, her own products, ends up in the United States leading the suffragist movement, is a fiery speaker and speaking about intersectionality. She believes that you can't divide women's vote from having abolition of slavery. That doesn't ultimately happen in that way. She's not on the strategy that wins, but she's a real amazing woman, and we really need to remember her much more. So I loved Emmy Noether. I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing Emmy Noether, I think it is. She's a mathematical genius. Talk about a woman who basically suffered incredible gender discrimination. She's this woman in Germany. Somehow she manages to get a PhD in math in an era that women aren't even allowed to get PhDs or study math. She then gets a job offer at Göttingen University, shows up, and there's no job. The job has been rescinded. She's allowed to teach under other men's names and with no pay. She lives in poverty, teaches, and develops the field of abstract algebra. Einstein calls her a genius. She, barely, eventually she's allowed to get a little bit of money, but then she's actually Jewish, and then she has to flee, and she flees to the United States and then dies after a couple years at Bryn Mawr, where she finally has a real job with real pay. What an amazing woman. So there's just so many, I loved Rosalind Franklin, and then Muriel Siebert. So we both loved Muriel Siebert, and it turns out that Justice Ginsburg and I both, she had met some of these women in the book, but I only met one, and that was by accident. And maybe I was like 19 or 20, and I was on a train going from New York to Philadelphia. I don't know, maybe I was 21. I don't remember exactly. And there's an empty seat next to me. And I have no idea who this woman is, but Muriel Siebert sits down next to me. And
Wow.
she was this woman who had to fight her way to buy a seat to on the New York Stock Exchange. Women were not allowed to have seats on the New York Stock Exchange. Now, this wasn't a rich woman. This woman had made her own way, but the only way she felt like she would be able to be successful in the financial sector is to have her own seat. She had to ask 10 men before one man would nominate her to be on the stock exchange. The day I met her, she had been in a helicopter crash and everyone had survived, but she had decided not to take the another helicopter home, and she took the train home, and she sat next to me. And she told me her story because she was upset. She had been in a crash. And she was just such an amazing woman. And then at the end of our conversation, she gave me her little business card, and she said,
wow.
Call me. And being a very, relatively self-involved 20-year-old, whatever, I didn't call her. And all for years, I was thinking, what was I thinking? Her name is Muriel Siebert. She's in the book, Muriel Siebert. She was also so far ahead of her time. She was talking about how diversity in the workforce was really meant better business before people were talking about this kind of stuff. It was considered nonsense. She was teaching financial literacy to young people and all kinds of people, and she gave all of her money back to charity. She was just a woman way ahead of her time. So she was amazing. So anyways, there's just so many women in the book, and it's a very eclectic group. So
yes. Did you place any emphasis on potentially highlighting women that you think may not be as well known as, for people to discover sort of new role models in the book?
So I think that Justice Ginsburg and I both felt that, well, basically, there are books about these women now, but as Justice Ginsburg said, there's not enough. And I think that because these women,
Right.
let's also talk about Justice Ginsburg's Jewish journey, which I think is a really important topic. Yeah. So we could have written about any kind of women, they didn't have to be Jewish women. And there are just so many amazing Jewish women who meant a lot to her or to me. Paulie Murray, who was this brilliant African-American woman who was a lawyer and a priest, Episcopal priest, who paved the way to thinking about the 14th Amendment as a way to, bring some kind of gender equity to the United States, legal gender equity in the United States. Frances Perkins, Eleanor Roosevelt. There were so many women that we could have included. But Jewish women was really they were the women who spoke to Justice Ginsburg during her life and at this point in her life when we were talking about the book. So remember, Justice Ginsburg was brought up in New York and Brooklyn. She went to conservative, synagogue. She went to Sunday school and after Hebrew school, and she went to Jewish day camp. She was a very studious, smart, serious, may I say, serious young woman. She studied, she learned her Torah lessons. She learned her prayers. She wasn't fooling around there in Hebrew school. And at age 16, her mom dies of cancer. And it's the day before Justice Ginsburg is supposed to graduate from high school. She knows all the prayers and she wants to participate in the the minyan and say the prayers, part of the Shiva. And she basically she's not allowed to because she's a woman. She's so hurt. She's so horrified that just sends her away from traditional Judaism of the time, which is traditional patriarchal Judaism. And this doesn't mean that she becomes less Jewish. I don't think you could find a more Jewish woman than Justice Ginsburg was. I mean, so informed by her Jewish values, the Jewish lessons, so thoughtful about the Jewish women of the Bible and the Torah, and also Deborah. I mean, just so informed and inspired by this. But what becomes her Judaism are the women that she's read about, women that her mother has taught her about, Henrietta Sold and Emma Lazarus and those kinds of women, and women of the Torah, women of the Haggadah, these. And then throughout her life, she's reading biographies about amazing Jewish women. She was always reading a new biography in the years that I knew her. And she just cared so passionately. So then fast forward to maybe about 10 years ago, she has a clerk, a male clerk, who has a wife who she discovers is a rabbi at a major synagogue here, a conservative synagogue, Adas Israel in Washington, D.C. Justice Ginsburg is just so thrilled that her clerk has a wife who's a rabbi. And she starts attending occasionally high holy day services or becoming sort of part of Adas Israel, occasionally showing up and finding a home in sort of, the more traditional modern Jewish world a little bit. So she even tries her hand. Rabbi Holtzblatt and Justice Ginsburg write a little bit of midrash together. And here we are, which turns out to be the last year of her life. We're sitting in her office. These Jewish women have been like boiling up in her all these years.
Wow.
And I think when I suggested this book to her, she's like, yes, these women are so important. These women are somehow part of her legacy. They're part of her Jewish legacy. They're part of her just legacy in general. And I think I didn't really quite understand that at the time, but as I thought back on it over the last year and a half or 2 years, I realized she spent so much time on the book, on the project and thinking about it. And she had so much else to do. And then eventually the cancer came back, and she was, as she wrote to me, told me, she was staving off cancer at the same time, by the way, as she was getting ready to, prepare for the next term, the 2020 term, because this woman really did her homework and she really had to prepare for her terms. And so she just cared so much about them. And I think that's why they were Jewish women. That's why we did Jewish women.
So it seemed like it was a deeply personal book for her.
Yes, I think so.
And you decided, so she actually passed away before the book was published.
Yes.
And you decided to do a chapter here about her. So can you tell us a little bit about the process of deciding on that and how did you do that?
Well, she actually passed away after reading the first draft of the bios, which was a very rough draft of the bios. But she had made very extensive comments, which I learned a lot from. And so I wasn't expecting her to die, and I don't think she was expecting herself to die at that time either. So we weren't prepared really, but I felt like after she died that we really needed a section of the book about her because she's so important. And most people, grown-ups and not, this is an intergenerational book of all ages, don't really know why I think Justice Ginsburg is important. She wasn't just important because she was the second woman to be on the Supreme Court or because she was Supreme Court Justice. It's what she did before she went to the court that was coming up with a legal workaround to gender equity in the United States through the 14th Amendment, since the ERA, we couldn't pass the ERA. We couldn't get the ERA ratified. It did get passed. Remember the ERA, we're trying to pass an Equal Rights Amendment. It's since 1921 when Alice Paul started this, right after we got the 19th Amendment. It starts, it gets passed in Congress in the 70s, when finally we have some more women who are in, Congress, and women outside Congress who are lobbying for it. But it never really ends up happening. So she's doing this in the 70s. So she's doing this work around. And I think also the amount of discrimination that she experienced in her life was huge. I mean, here's this woman who graduates, first in her class, I'm sure in Cornell and Harvard and Columbia Law School or whatever, tied for first. And she's, besides not being able to get a job in a law firm, she applies to be a clerk at the Supreme Court. And guess what? She's rejected. Why? She's a woman. I mean, we're talking there's just endless discrimination that she experienced. And I think it's really important for us to know that.
Can you tell us a little bit about Moment Magazine and also about the RBG Role Model Project that you have founded in her name?
Well, so let's talk a little bit. I'll talk about Moment in a minute. Okay, we'll go to Moment next. But so in the process of talking about this book is really about role models for people of all generations. And we still don't have enough women to discuss in the world. And so it's adding women role models here. But what's a role model? A role model is not somebody that you worship or is a cult or that you want to be like. It's really identifying some traits in people. This is how I define it, that you feel like you are admirable traits that you would like to incorporate in yourself. This was something that we talked about, and it's important to have a wide variety of women role models. So I just want to say that Justice Ginsburg became one of my role models in the process of knowing her over the last, I guess, really 10 years of her life. And that was because I learned some things from her that I was just missing and that I needed to fill in. One, first, I thought I was a persistent person, but when I saw the level of her persistence, I realized, whoop, I'm not working at the full level of persistence that I could be working at. That's absolutely one. I thought I had high expectations. I really didn't. I had this conversation once with her, maybe, I don't know, 2014 or so, where I said something like, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if someday we have half the Supreme Court is women? And she said, what are you talking about? We've had all men for centuries and nobody made a fuss about that. We should have all women on the court. Nobody should make a fuss about that. I was like, wow, she's right. I hadn't really been thinking in that way. And then most importantly, I just want to say, and this is very important, it's not just a message to me, but to all of us. I think I told her once, I was sitting in her office and I was saying, well, I like being a journalist and an artist and a writer because, I'm kind of behind the scenes and I don't really have to get out there and talk in front of people and be out there. And she looked at me and she said, get over it. I was like, what? And she just said, get over it. If you do not speak your mind, no one's going to speak it for you. And I went, somehow coming from Justice Ginsburg, this kind of just went right into my brain in a way that it had never gone in my brain before. And I went, Justice Ginsburg, who was by nature a very reticent person, this was not she wasn't like a schmoozer. She wasn't somebody who went in the room and took over the conversation and got up on the stage and emanated, this vast energy. And although she was amazing, but that wasn't her style. And it took a lot of work for her in law school to be able to speak out and hold her own, especially her first year of law school at Harvard. And she had told me about this. And I'm like, if she can do this, well, I can do it too. So I had to really force myself. I took public speaking class and I love to sing. So I took some singing classes and made myself sing out in places where I would never sing. And I took, musical theater class, and I took a improv class, and I took a stand-up class at the DC Improv and did a show. And I mean, I decided if she could do these things, and I could do these things, because, this is not a message just for me. This is a message for, all women, and also for men who really appreciate having women being part of political thinking and of power. And I have to say, if there's any message for this book, it's that women are very, very important. We need women in power. We need it's not a matter of gender, it's a matter of traits. The kinds of traits that women bring to power in general, and being generalizing, but, making consensus, finding consensus, not dissing people just to diss people, not sort of like unnecessary arguing and showing off. There's just a whole bunch of kind of traits that women bring, also very practical at times. I think that are really, really important for humanity today. And the more of these traits that we have, whether they're men who appreciate these traits or women, we need to have them, people in power, and power, all kinds of power. I mean, all kinds of positions. All of us need to get out there and not just donate money, not just, bake a cake to support something. We have to go out there and become the leaders of all gender. And I'm not just saying that, everyone of all ages, we've got to get out there and be the leaders, because we do not have gender equity in this country yet. We do not have legal gender equity in this country. And we're in no way does it look like we're going to have it in the near future. And we need to get out there and get more women in power, in not just like medicine and law, but in actual political power, because it's really not till we have a vast majority of women in Congress and in Senate and in major political positions that we're going to really be able to pass an equal rights amendment. And that's really important to pass that. It is very important for democracy to have that. We're one of the few democracies that don't have that. And I think Justice Ginsburg cared deeply about that. And I care really deeply about that. So the message of this book is that we have so much work to do. And when I actually was really interesting, because when I had some young people read the book at like 11, 12, 13, 14, not a single one of those young people, and they were all super educated, wonderful kids, including family members, knew that their great grandmothers couldn't have a credit card in their name, weren't allowed to own a piece of property in their name if they were married, and so much else. And not a one of them really knew that women do not have legal gender equity in the United States. And as I've been talking about the book to lots of people, most grownups don't know that either. They just don't know that, really, yes, Justice Ginsburg helped us create a workaround, the 14th Amendment, using the 14th Amendment to gender equity. But it's not what she thought was the end. It was a workaround. It was temporary. We have so much work ahead of us. And so this is just so important for us to do. And in the end of the book is a call to action about things that you can do at any age. But one of those things is to remember Justice Ginsburg she didn't argue with people. She didn't have political fights with people. She made bonds. She created trust and bonds with people who she disagreed with, like Justice Scalia. This is hugely important. She didn't agree with any of his political points of view, I'm sure, or even his style, but they still managed to maintain a friendship. And I think that's really important. We have to do that. We have to build trust in small increments. And we have to have she was a long-term strategic thinker. And we're not doing that. We're all caught up in the moment of the politics of the moment. We're not really thinking strategically about how to have gender equity, and not just gender equity, but really what I call kind of the values of the Enlightenment. And I don't say Enlightenment with a capital E, like the European Enlightenment or just the Jewish Haskalah. There were many periods in time where we've had enlightenments, and some of those were in traditional cultures, but we are forgetting the struggle the suffering and the struggle that went in to get us to where we are today in societies. And we're not moving forward, and we need to remember that, and we need to hold on to that. So it's bigger even than gender equity.
Mhm. Can you explain a little bit more about the workaround that Justice Ginsburg talked about versus the Equal Rights Amendment which didn't
Yes,
pass?
absolutely. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but just in simple terms, she basically based, you know, she basically chose a few cases that allowed help the law to change. I'm going to describe this terribly right now. Based on the 14th Amendment, which is a clause put in the Constitution about slavery. She basically tried specific cases that changed a lot of laws in the United States, but didn't actually change the Constitution. We do not have an amendment in the Constitution that gives women equal rights, and there are many reasons why we should have that.
Mhm. So she essentially established case law to
Yes.
give women the rights that they would have gotten if the Equal Rights Amendment had passed. Or
It's
maybe
hard
some
to
of
it's
them.
hard to say that women have. There's still so many places where women do not have equity. I mean, certainly in wages, there are all these there are laws that have been passed to try to address wages, sexual harassment. There's a lot to be done. There are actually laws in some states and cities where, technically women aren't allowed to wear pants. There's all sorts of laws out there which would be much better if we had an equal rights amendment of some kind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you were talking a little bit before about the diversity in the book and the various, that you try to kind of broad swath. And so I was wondering, and you decided to do it to present the book in chronological order, all the way from biblical women through up to the present. What sort of went into that choice of just kind of doing it chronologically versus otherwise? And would you be writing, or do you think Justice Ginsburg would be writing a second book or even a third?
Well, Justice Ginsburg wanted to have some live women in the book too. She's very close to Gloria Steinem, and we're both fans of Gloria Steinem, and we thought about having Gloria in the book. It seemed a little odd to have her in this book where we had a lot of historical and biblical women. And it was a little hard to get our minds around having, live people and people who were dead. So I think that the thought is that, well, there was time, and if we wanted, we could do more in the future. And certainly, but that's one reason why Gloria Steinem was not in the book. So, but I don't know. It was such a big project to work on this book. And I do have the list of 150 women that maybe someday I'll look back at again and maybe even write up in a kind of neat way. So there are so many other women that we could have done something on. I mean, so we are creating something called the Role Model Project, and it's in her memory. And it will be many things, including it'll have a website which will have different other role models who weren't included in the book, not necessarily only Jewish, but for example, Paulie Murray, who was a huge influence on Justice Ginsburg, because it was really Paulie Murray who came up with the idea of using the 14th Amendment, or she was one of the people who came up with the idea of using the 14th Amendment to create some sense of gender equity in the United States. And then Justice Ginsburg actually laid out the legal strategy to do that. So it'll also include some workshops for kids who are marginalized to help them to learn how to identify, traits, role models in a kind of healthy way, in a way to sort of expand emotional intelligence. It's also going to include a contest, some like a essay contest. So we have a few projects going on, and that's to, you know, kind of, it's just, I think it's just it's so important that I don't want it to end with the book, but I feel like I'd like it to become more interactive at this point.
Okay. Wow, that sounds amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about Moment Magazine, which you're editor-in-chief of? And then after that, we'll move over to Q&A with the audience, because I see there are many, many questions that people want to ask.
Sure. Okay. So I got to meet Justice Ginsburg through Moment. Moment is a beautiful magazine, and it's an actual print magazine, but it definitely lives online. Many parts of it are online at momentmag.com. And we have so many publications coming out of Moment that are just amazing, by the way. And live programming, like every week, we have incredible speakers. For example, we have Robert Siegel interviewing Natan Sharansky tomorrow, you know, about Ukraine, just about Russia and Putin. I mean, just amazing stuff. So I just want to tell you that the magazine started in Boston. It was co-founded by Elie Wiesel and Leonard Fine. Elie was teaching at Boston University. Label was, I think, was teaching at Brandeis at that time. And it was incubated, I believe, in Brandeis. And it was like a little newsletter, and it became a magazine. It was a big deal at its time in 1975 when it launched, and stayed in Boston for about 11 years. And then it moved to Washington, D.C. And I took it over in 2004. Obviously, all the other editors in chiefs and CEOs were men. So it came, and I was just from a very different generation and a very different outlook. And the magazine is really inclusive, and we explore a lot of big questions from very kind of broad perspectives, because being able to be a critical thinker and make your own mind up is so important. And we just have lots of wonderful, wonderful sections, including like one that actually has been in the magazine since 1975, which is called Spice Box, where we have like little bloopers about, you know, rabbis that are written as rabbits, but they're really fun. But we have just so many, it's really a beautiful publication. So I encourage you, go to momentmag.com and subscribe and explore our website.
Thank you so much. And if people want the signed version, autographed version of this book, you can also go to Moment Magazine online and get that. And we'll send out all of that information. Thank you so much, Nadine. And now I'm going to turn it over to Olga, who will take some questions from the audience.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and amazingly interesting discussion, and Natty for hosting the questions. I mean, I feel like I learned so much, and I'm deeply moved by the work that you're doing, and so excited to learn more about these projects. And hopefully we at the Vilna can be a part of that and continue the discussions together. One of the questions that I personally had and was really moved by when you were discussing the importance of what a role model really is and how we define a role model. I'd love to hear from you how you would think, based on your interactions and your knowledge of RBG, how would she define that? And maybe an example of you think someone that she would think of, because I think of her as a role model. So it'd be just so interesting to hear a role model's perspective of a role model.
I mean, I'm going to guess from our conversations that Deborah, because was a woman that really inspired her, who was a judge and a lawyer and who believed in justice. Henrietta Zold definitely was a woman that she really admired. She really loved writing, and she had studied with Vladimir Nabokov at Cornell. She loved Anne Frank. She actually made me rethink Anne Frank, because, you know, I really hadn't thought about Anne Frank for that much for a long time, but just Anne Frank was such a feminist. Paulie Murray was another woman who she's actually, I think, she is interviewed in the Paulie Murray documentary, My Name is Paulie, which you all should watch. It's really fabulous.
I'm writing that down.
Yes. So these are, you know, she and I did talk about role models, and she of course writes the intro, and in there, she talks about how having more than one role model is really important, I definitely, we deliberately did not use the word hero or influencers, or superhero. Role models are real people. Role models may be real people that you read about in history. A role model could even be somebody, a fictional character from a book that is such a powerful that you learn something from. But really, a role model again is somebody that you can grow from learning from. And I didn't understand, like I was always searching for role models, but I didn't have the language. When I was a kid, I was reading all these biographies and I was talking to people, and I didn't really realize that what you're doing is you're learning from each person you meet. Some people you're not going to learn a lot from, but there are people who, and it doesn't matter if it's your rabbi or it's your teacher or your professor, or maybe it's the bus driver, but you identify something about them, some deep kindness, some way they think about the world, some way that they understand the world. Perhaps it's even a sentence that they have said that just helps you to begin to fill in what I would call the architecture of your mind. And I think it's
Yeah.
so important for learning. And I wish I had understood this earlier. And sometimes, it's the same thing with a book. You read a book, you can't absorb the entire book. You can't absorb an entire person, but there could be there's this one sentence in the book that it really strikes you. And you think about it. Why does it strike me so much? Why is there something that this person has just said or is that strikes me so much? And think about it, incorporate it. This is a lifelong process, by the way. This is not something, maybe we all started when we're in 4th or 5th grade, when we're kind of thinking about the world for the first time and beyond our own little family circles, but it goes on forever. And I also want to say that Justice Ginsburg was an incredible role model for aging. Talk about a woman who never stopped.
I saw those workout videos.
Yes, it was the workout videos. This started after her husband died. She starts working out. She was pretty sick at the end of her life here. She was so dedicated to this book. She just kept working. She didn't give up for a minute. She just kept doing her thing. She was just so dedicated, and she was testing herself with new things. She loved opera. She often she would have loved to have been an opera singer had she had a voice. But the last few years of her life, she was appearing in the Washington Opera at the Kennedy Center in non-singing roles. This was not a woman who was hogged the spotlight. She just got up there and did her thing, and she took such joy out of it and such pleasure out of it, and that was amazing. So I more than answered your question, probably.
Yeah. It's just so inspiring to hear those anecdotes and information, and it's really moving. And I guess I have one more question. If anybody has anything else, any other questions, please feel free to type it in. But I'd just love to know how this book has influenced your personal writing and moving forward, your personal projects. I know that further on you'll be doing the role model project, but how has this process changed the way that you're approaching your work?
So I have to say that I had no idea when I started this project that I would suddenly come out of the woodwork, as you would say. I've kind of gone beyond being an editor and a journalist and a writer and an artist suddenly, and I've become I just find that I have unlimited passion for this topic. It's just so important. I look at what's going on in Ukraine. I look at a political leader like Putin, and I go, wow, the whole world needs women leaders. We're just talking about the essence of toxic masculinity, the worst of masculinity here, which has been considered the regular behavior of political leaders for millennia. And
Definitely.
Yeah, and so I just care so much about this. So I stepped a little bit out of my normal journalistic role in when it comes to this particular topic. And I think it's also, I feel like I grew up without a voice. And I mean, I've been working on getting a voice my whole life. It's been a slow process. But this book has pulled together a lot of things within me, not anger. I mean, again, when I say having a voice, I mean, it's not an angry voice, but I want us all to be really paying attention and being aware of what we can do and what's missing in our culture and society in the United States, in the Jewish world, and globally.
Thank you so much. I just want to say I definitely agree with you, and I'm taking taking this all in, and I know our audience is too, and excited to work with you further and continue expanding on these ideas and bringing them to not just the Vilna community, but to communities of women and men and generations as a whole. So I just want to say thank you again on behalf of the Vilna and everyone listening today. Thank you so much. And thank you to Natty for joining us as well. In the chat, I'm going to add in some links for some of our upcoming events. And again, this is all going to be recorded and up on our YouTube site tomorrow. So thank you again, Nadine and Natty, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Natty. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.